morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me as part of Washington State University's Spring 2023 Urban Forest Health webinar series. My name is Stephanie Helms, and I'm an arboriculturalist at Seattle Department of Transportation and also the coordinator for the Seattle Committee on Invasive Pests. Thanks again, and really looking forward to sharing what we've done so far with the Washington Urban Forest Pest Readiness Playbook and implementing pest readiness efforts here in Seattle. We'll dive right into it, and first and foremost, thank you so much to Maria from the Washington Invasive Species Council for an excellent presentation on the playbook, why it's so important, and the self-assessment and key actions that's outlined within. And just wanted to go over a little bit today about how the City of Seattle looked at the playbook through the interdepartmental lens that we have, and I'll go into that a little bit more in the next slide, and tried to figure out how some of those recommendations fit in with Seattle's organizational structure. Also, what existing urban forestry efforts were already ongoing in Seattle that helped make us already pest ready. Also, what pest readiness efforts have we achieved since launching the Seattle Committee on Invasive Pests, and how did we do it? And where do we still need to improve? And finally, why is pest readiness so important? Hoping that some of our achievements that we're going to describe here today will really push home why this playbook is so important. So when looking at the playbook and its recommendations, any city, large or small, has to look at their own organizational structure to understand how those different things can apply to whether you're on a campus or work in a large city such as myself, or whether you're just trying to get some of your pest readiness efforts off the ground. So for Seattle's case, we have multiple departments with urban forestry roles. That includes departments such as Seattle Department of Transportation, such as where I'm from, Seattle Parks and Recreation, Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections, etc. So we have a lot of different resources and a lot of different roles, which is really great. We also have a lot of departmental in-house crews and many contractor crews per department as well. We also have separate departmental roles in tree maintenance. So, for example, Seattle Department of Transportation, or SDOT, is not typically going to work on a parks tree and vice versa. We also have different departmental permitting processes involving maintenance recommendations to the public. So while I may be processing a permit to work on a right-of-way tree, parks may be permitting pruning on a parks tree, so on and so forth. So how do we make sure those processes are streamlined? We also have multiple different departments that interface with private tree care industry and multiple organizations such as the ISA within that private tree care industry as well. We also have a shared maintenance responsibility of trees in the right-of-way, so trees that were planted by SDOT are maintained by SDOT, and trees that were not planted by the department are the responsibility of the adjacent property owner. We also have just different tree care needs based on the location of trees, and when I say different tree care needs, I mean the support to actually do the work. So for example, if SDOT's working on a tree in the right-of-way, depending on what kind of right-of-way, if it's an arterial, we may need traffic operations support. And like any city, little available resources in mitigation and tree planting. We do have a lot of resources allocated to maintenance of trees through the Move Seattle Levy, for example, with Department of Transportation. But otherwise, it's hard for any city to come by adequate resources to continue to grow and maintain an urban forest. So now that we've had that basic overview of Seattle's organizational structure, I just want to dive into the first portion of the playbook in terms of understanding risk, which includes tree resources, pests of concern, risk analysis, and pest pathways and prevention, to demonstrate how we took some of those recommendations and plugged them into our already existing structure and efforts. So I'll break down each section of the self-assessment in the playbook here by two different categories. One, what is our baseline urban forestry initiatives that we already had ongoing at the time of our initial assessment back in 2020 that we're able to build off of? In this case, we have different inventories from different departments, such as our street tree inventory from SDOT and also the ongoing parks inventory from Seattle Parks and Recreation. We also have a follow-up to the 2016 tree canopy cover assessment that was just done recently in 2021. So we had some data to play with already, and because we had that data, we were able to combine different inventories by department and create a Seattle priority pest list. We were also able to take that pest list and create priority pest risk analysis maps. And so that really gave us an idea of what's at risk here in our urban forests in Seattle based off of our urban forest composition. But of course we ran into a few hiccups too. But because of some of those hiccups, we were able to actually embark on a new project called the Citywide Tree Data Warehouse Project. To dive a little deeper, here you have SDOT's street tree inventory. Now keep in mind this is only street trees through Seattle Department of Transportation. So this does not include trees on parks property or on any other city jurisdiction. However, I just wanted to show everybody this because it is a massive data set that really was the backbone to a lot of our different inventory efforts. So this actually scored us a few points in the understanding risk section of the self-assessment, which was great. That being said, we still needed to fill in a few more data gaps here, so we actually enlisted the help of some GIS analysts in Seattle Public Utilities to help combine our inventory with Parks inventory and other data sets from different departments to achieve a level of data integrity so we could create the pest priority list, in which you will see here momentarily. Here are just some of the static maps created through that effort. And so while we're only showing 3 priority pests here out of about 8, I wanted to highlight these 3 for many different reasons. One is showing the massive tree loss that we would endure if Asian longhorn beetle were introduced here in Seattle. Then we also have Syrinx wood wasp, which attacks mainly conifers, which would be a big ecological loss for us here in the city as well. We also have emerald ash borer, and while ash only comprises of about, I think, a little bit less than 4% of our canopy cover here in the city, as you can see, it's planted a lot along arterials in different neighborhoods that would experience dramatic tree loss, even if it's a little bit more localized. And many of these neighborhoods were actually also historically underserved neighborhoods. So how are we looking at some of these issues through an equity lens and prioritizing these neighborhoods for mitigation and replanting after such a devastating tree loss event? The creation of those priority pest maps were eye-opening and helped urban forestry staff articulate the massive impact of invasive pest introduction here in Seattle. But even with these maps, we knew we would have to run that analysis on a frequent basis to account for changes in data. And additionally, what happens if a totally new pest is introduced in Washington? It was such a heavy lift to combine and rectify all those different inventories from different departments that it wasn't feasible to merge that data every time we needed to analyze a new threat. After we relayed that issue to our teams and their management, SDOT GIS Committee took on our proposed project titled the Citywide Tree Data Warehouse, currently being built now, which will combine the data into one citywide dataset for the purposes of being able to perform analysis on trees across all jurisdictions here in the city. Not only does this support our pest readiness efforts, as it includes a pest management tracking table highlighted in red there for removals and for treatment, but it also supports other departmental efforts such as understanding citywide tree impacts from climate change, storm damage tracking, and so much more. And we're so excited for this product to go live this year. And once we have the Citywide Tree Data Warehouse live, we can start breaking down the impacts of tree loss to more localized levels, helping us prioritize what trees to treat and where, what neighborhoods to hold meetings, form budget estimates, and so much more. And you can see here on the right-hand side is actually the same emerald ash borer map where we actually break down per neighborhoods and also the canopy coverage of that neighborhood that's comprised of ash. So really excited that once we have this tool to see what we can really start analyzing and what messages we can really bring to our upper management. But of course, right now, we don't have that additional analysis done on social impacts of tree loss, and that is going to be dependent on the Citywide Tree Data Warehouse project. We also still have gaps in our data. For example, we don't have data for trees on private property, and we also are lacking point data for trees, say, in unimproved right-of-ways. So there's still some gaps that we need to fill in. We also need to understand the areas of pest introduction and understanding where the pathways are and areas where pests can be transported. In a city as dense as Seattle, it's really tough to imagine what places people aren't traveling to and from to. So it's going to be a real challenge to figure out if something's detected in one part of the city, how could it reach another part of the city? We also have training for crews, but of course we also need to work with private tree care to boost our prevention efforts as well. So in this particular instance, we scored a 14, but we scored an 11 at first. So already over the past few years, we have really, upped our score in understanding risk. So now that you kind of see where we scored in terms of understanding risk and how we improved our pest readiness efforts, let's dive into capacities to support a response. So luckily here, we also had a decent score with this one because we already have staff with pest response experience, including myself with emerald ash borer response experience from Baltimore, Maryland in 2015. We have incident command system training for City of Seattle staff, which was extremely helpful as well. We're also very close with the Washington Invasive Species Council and our state and federal partners, so if something new does arrive in Washington, we will surely hear about it. And we've also been working on diversifying our planting list for quite some time. But of course, we still need to have a good feel for all of our different external partners and stakeholders, so we create an external partner contact list. We also revised our street tree selection guidance tool to also include invasive pest information on those as well. We also removed certain host trees from city lists and permitted plantings, and also we had to use the playbook at one point for a false alarm, and thankfully it was a false alarm, but it reinforced how quickly we got a response and how quickly we got an inspection, which was fantastic. So knowing who to call and who to talk to is extremely important, which is why we created the Seattle Committee on Invasive Pests, so we could start chatting interdepartmentally to figure out how we're going to apply a lot of these pest readiness efforts, again, to our existing structure here in Seattle. But it also starts the conversations, which is extremely important, and allows us to, as staff, when we see something, we say something, and we can help check each other, decide whether we need to actually elevate this to our state and federal partners. And in this case, we actually did have somebody from Parks reach out about a row of dead ash trees right next to actually a huge bakery, Fran's Bakery, if any of you know it. And so when you have that many semis that transport goods and services back and forth, and you have a row of ash trees that are exhibiting some infestation symptoms of emerald ash borer, starts to get a little worrisome. So because we have SCIP, or Seattle Committee on Invasive Pests, they immediately reached out to our group. We were able to go inspect it ourselves. We decided, this is a little too close to call. It's a little too scary. So, let's document what we have. Let's go to the playbook and let's look at what they say in terms of reaching out through the Washington Invasive Species Reporting app, which we did, and we got a response within hours. And because of this, we were able to rule out the possibility of emerald ash borer, luckily in this instance. But it just goes to show that the playbook works, and it was an excellent exercise for us to feel more ready when we see something that just doesn't seem quite right. Additionally, we've also been pushing the Washington Invasive Species Reporting app, not only to folks who are within urban forestry or are involved in invasive pest response, but also any urban forestry or non-urban forestry related staff. Because when you're out and about, you could see something that is suspicious, and we also want our staff to be able to educate Seattle residents who maybe have questions on invasive pest preparedness on how to use this app if they see something that just does not seem right. Along with promoting the Washington Invasive Species Council reporting app, we've also included invasive pest information added to the street tree selection guidance tool. So those, whether they're developers or whether they're just Seattle residents looking to plant something either in their backyard or their planting strip, they're able to scroll over some host species and see that they're being discouraged at this time due to the possibility of infestation. We also have tree planting diversification standards, so we've also eliminated host trees such as ash trees from our planting lists, and I've also just been advising on right tree, right place and basic tree diversification standards to the public as well. We also have an invasive pest page coming to the Trees for Seattle website coming soon, so stay tuned. Areas needing improvement in this particular section of the self-assessment include identifying those sufficient funding sources. I've never worked for or heard of an urban forestry group in cities large or small with sufficient funding in general. So being able to look for grants either on the state or federal level or figuring out ways to maximize our current resources is paramount in being able to support these pest readiness efforts and any urban forestry efforts within the city. And also understanding the different levels of invasive species response. There's many invasive species responses where, for example, a place like Seattle would be doing treatments, and sometimes there are invasive pest introductions where there are no treatments. So how do we look at those different scenarios and figure out where do we need to maybe say bolster our outreach component for a particular priority pest? Or where are our resources in terms of removal and replacement, and how do those apply to a particular pest, say, over another? All right, rolling on through. I want to make sure I'm doing good on time here. So, ability to expedite informed decision making. So that's looking at some subcategories such as urban forestry staff, local authority, permit processes, and leadership. And again, luckily we have urban forestry staff that we were able to combine to form the Seattle Committee on Invasive Pests. We also have a deep understanding of our permitting processes because we are all in some way or another probably involved in those. And so we're really able to look at the nitty-gritty details of those processes and see where we can streamline some of those efforts. We also have been promoting urban forestry efforts to other non-urban forestry related working groups because that's so important if we're going to have a One Seattle response. And because of this, we were able to define some of those roles and responsibilities through SCIP. And we're also trying to interpret the Seattle Municipal Code through a pest readiness lens and using that to revise the street tree manual. Luckily, we scored pretty high because we already have a lot of plans, policy, and code around urban tree management here in Seattle. And so we do have resources such as our street tree manual, our urban forest management plan, and also the strategic plan upgrade to the Green Seattle Partnership strategic 20-year plan. So we have a lot of great resources that really organize our interdepartmental efforts here in the city around sound tree management. But although we have the staff, we have the supporting plans, we have so many different resources at our fingertips, but we still don't have a specific urban forest pest plan yet. Right now we are in process of working on our City of Seattle invasive pest response framework, as well as our emerald ash borer response plan since it is now in Oregon. We also still need to identify staff and funding support for permit process expedition. So we've identified the spots within those processes that we could improve, especially at a time where there's possibly an emergency. But of course, trying to identify the staff and the funding to do that will be a bit of a challenge. And of course, while we're looking at revising some parts of the street tree manual to include more information about invasive pest preparedness, we also really need to strengthen our Seattle Municipal Code around invasive pest response. And last but not least, community support to expand your impact. So again, on the baseline urban forestry initiative side, we already have urban forestry staff across multiple different city departments, some of which went to form the Seattle Committee on Invasive Pests. We have early detection messaging that's disseminated through the Trees for Seattle program, which is our education and outreach arm for urban forestry and the umbrella for all the city's urban forestry efforts. And under the Trees for Seattle program is the Trees for Neighborhoods program, which we heard an excellent presentation on last week from Lou and Allie. So our enhanced pest readiness efforts included the formation of SCIP. We also have the new upcoming Trees for Seattle's pest page. Trees for Seattle also disseminates information yearly on participation in August Tree Check Month, as well as tree care outreach in terms of just proper watering and mulching and keeping our trees happy and resilient to begin with. We also have our urban forestry education hours and our tree crew pest checks. Here's just an example of some pest life cycle timeline information that will be included on the Trees for Seattle pest page. This was done by a graduate intern for Trees for Seattle, Liu Zhang. If you would like her link to her thesis, I would highly advise tuning into last week's webinar series on the Trees for Seattle program. We've also been striving to keep up with our urban forestry pest education hours. That's inviting folks from either our state or federal partners or urban forestry staff from other cities to present on some of the issues that they're seeing and to also help provide some additional information to urban forestry staff about invasive pest preparedness. And of course, we're always striving to fill in the gaps in our messaging. Specifically, we need culturally specific messaging to ensure we're reaching the diverse audiences that are here within the city of Seattle. And that would include things such as language translation services, looking at recent government investments to that particular neighborhood, and understanding that neighborhood history, and keeping our messaging and outreach accessible and transparent to all residents. So now that you see some of the readiness efforts that were recommended in the playbook and how we've applied them to either some of our existing structures or existing efforts or how we've created new pest readiness efforts altogether, just want to share our score really quickly. So when we first took this self-assessment back in July 2020, you can see our score on the right-hand side here. And since then, we have actually increased to The score that you see before you as of this month. Now, this is so absolutely exciting because we have as much as a 25% increase in some of these categories, such as understanding risk, with some of the new projects such as the Citywide Tree Data Warehouse project that we've embarked on since our original assessment in 2020. And this is also exciting because it looks like we are actually meeting, if not exceeding, these benchmarks. So we're feeling pretty pest ready here. But that being said, we also still have a lot of challenges to still overcome as well. There's always still room for improvement. And as we deep dive into some of these recommendations in the playbook, we're realizing that there's more opportunities that maybe we didn't consider the first time around or even the second or third time. But what it does show here is that the playbook works. It really does. It shows us the roadmap that we need to embark on to get to where we need to be. And it is a great way to show and demonstrate to leaders and decision makers and executive leadership on why pest readiness is so important to any and all of our urban forestry efforts. And again, we're always going to be looking forward because pest readiness really is, it's a journey. It's not something that we're going to arrive at that perfect score and be done. We're always going to be reassessing and fine-tuning all of our efforts to make sure that we are as ready as we can be for an invasive pest detection tomorrow. And of course, some of those challenges that we'll have to overcome, including the complexity of our organizational structure. As you see, we do have a lot of resources here in Seattle, but we have a lot of complexity. And so how do we work around those roadblocks, logistics, and everything to try and maximize and streamline our efforts as much as possible? And of course, funding, as I said before, is always tough to come by, or at least it feels like it is within the urban forestry world. So we're always going to be keeping our finger on the pulse for any type of additional funding that could come our way. And of course, with that additional funding, staff capacity, because of course we need the awesome urban forestry folks that we all know and love to make this magic happen. And of course, we still have some head scratchers and everything over here in the Seattle side of things. We're still looking at what do we do in terms of proper disposal of wood waste. That's going to be a big challenge for us because Seattle land is at a premium. So where would we even store some of this host tree wood long term? That's a question we're still posing and still trying to wrap our minds around. And of course, we also really need guidance on tree removal on private property. Where can we provide assistance to property owners, or how do we, say, remove a host tree in a particularly tricky spot in terms of property lines, jurisdiction, etc. So where are those gray areas and how do we approach them? And of course, I put in here support from the Mayor's Office and Council, but we recently did have the One Seattle Tree Plan come out via executive order from the Mayor's Office, and they actually had a mention of pest readiness. Now, nobody came to me from the Mayor's Office asking about pest readiness, so what that goes to show is those conversations that have bubbled up from the staff level, from Seattle Committee on Invasive Pests, to our management and above, that pest readiness is now in the forefront of our minds in terms of being able to maintain, care for, and grow our urban forest here in Seattle. And again, that's why the playbook is absolutely amazing and so important to all communities, large and small, throughout Washington state. It is something that even if you embark on just the smallest steps, you will make progress. And you have support systems through our state and federal partners to help you every step of the way. I cannot even begin to stress that enough. So whether you're scratching your head being like, man, I don't even know where to start, or whether you're like Seattle and maybe already have some urban forestry staff and some efforts that you can build off of, take those steps today. It is possible, especially because we don't know when the next invasive pest introduction is going to be here in Washington state. But we can guess that it's going to start or be detected in a city first. And if we're going to protect our state forests, we have to start locally. And when we think about pest readiness and its possibilities, we also have to think about what it means for us. It means protecting our urban trees and our state forests. It means strengthening environmental resilience in our communities. It means keeping our residents healthy and connecting with like-minded staff within our own workplaces, and creating those opportunities for new urban forestry initiatives and improving the relationship between people and trees. So if anything here has inspired you today, I hope it has. This has been 3 years in the making here for us, and we still have such a long way to go, but it's been a wild ride, and we're really happy with the results that we've had so far. If some of our challenges or something that you've worked through and want to connect, please give me a call. And likewise, if there's something that we've been able to achieve that you're like, you know what, we've just been hitting a roadblock in our community, let's connect and talk about maybe ways that we can give some advice or some guidance to make pest readiness efforts in your city work. And last but definitely not least, just want to give a huge shout out to not only all the departments involved in pest readiness here in Seattle, but all the folks on the committee who have given their time and expertise to make all these achievements happen. The Seattle Committee on Invasive Pests is comprised of field staff such as myself who give time monthly to weigh in on different issues, look at invasive pest preparedness measures, and figure out how they will work here in Seattle. And so all these folks have been absolutely key in making all these successes happen, and I cannot extend my gratitude to all of the urban forestry staff here in Seattle who have contributed to this, and also our state and federal partners whose support and creation of this playbook has made this possible for us. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much to Washington State University for putting on this webinar series. Thank you to the Washington Invasive Species Council for the creation of the playbook, to all our state and federal partners for all of your help in making this possible, and everything down to the field staff who also made this possible here locally here in Seattle. Thank you all again, and please reach out if you have any questions.